On a map, Rzhev did not look like a place that should cost two armies so much blood. It was not a capital. It was not the greatest industrial center in the Soviet Union, and capturing it would not immediately decide the war. Yet by early 1942, Rzhev had become one of the most dangerous names on the entire Eastern Front. The reason was larger than the city itself. After the German advance on Moscow had been stopped, German forces still held a broad stretch of territory west of the Soviet capital. On the map, that territory projected deep into the Red Army's lines, forming what became known as the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. A salient can be imagined as a fist pushed into an opponent's formation. From the German side, it was a weapon. It kept German forces relatively close to Moscow, protected important routes across the Central Front, and forced Soviet commanders to consider the possibility that another offensive might someday emerge from this region. From the Soviet side, however, the salient looked like a blade that had never been removed. As long as the Germans remained around Rzhev, Moscow could not feel completely secure. That was why the Red Army soldiers sent there were not simply being asked to recover a town on the Upper Volga. They were being asked to remove a threat hanging over the capital of their country. But the shape that made Rzhev dangerous also made it vulnerable. A salient projecting into enemy territory has long flanks. If Soviet forces could break through to the north and south, then drive mobile formations behind the German position, the troops inside might be separated from their roads, railways and supplies. On paper, the solution seemed almost obvious. There was no need to capture every trench. There was no need to fight through every fortified village. Cut through the base of the salient, and everything inside could become one enormous pocket. But a map could not show the dense forests, marshes, rivers, and roads that dissolved into mud. It could not show villages turned into strong points, minefields hidden beneath snow, or narrow crossings where an entire armored formation could be delayed by a single destroyed bridge. And it could not show what the battlefield looked like to one soldier moving through a newly opened breach. He could not see the full operation. He did not know whether the unit beside him had kept pace. He did not know whether the supply road behind him was still open. And he could not know whether the Germans ahead were retreating or waiting for the right moment to strike the exposed sides of the advance. Rzhev therefore became two things at once. To the Germans, it was a forward position that kept pressure on Moscow. To the Soviets, it was a trap that might someday close around the entire German Ninth Army. Both sides looked at the same ground and saw an opportunity to force the other to pay an unbearable price. And that created the first great paradox of the battle. If the salient was so dangerous for the Germans, why were they determined to hold it? And if it gave Germany such an important advantage, why would the German army eventually abandon it after defending it successfully for more than a year? The answer begins with what Rzhev represented inside the minds of German commanders. They were not merely defending a city. They were defending a possibility. And to understand how valuable that possibility seemed, we must first understand why Germany refused to let Rzhev go. If the Rzhev salient had too long, exposed flanks and always faced the danger of encirclement, then the most reasonable question is why the Germans did not simply abandon it from the beginning. Why hold a mass of territory projecting deep into the enemy's lines? Why defend hundreds of miles of trenches, supply roads and ruined villages, when every new Soviet offensive might turn the salient into a trap? The answer begins with Rzhev's position on the map. After the German failure before Moscow in the winter of 1941, German forces had been pushed away from the outskirts of the Soviet capital, but they had not been driven far back into the west. The German Ninth Army still held Rzhev, Sykioka, and a network of roads and railways leading toward Vyazma. That meant German troops remained relatively close to Moscow. They were not close enough to launch another immediate attack on the capital, but they were close enough that Soviet commanders could not completely dismiss the possibility. Rzhev therefore resembled a loaded weapon that had not yet been fired. The Germans might not have been ready to pull the trigger. They might not have possessed the strength to renew the drive on Moscow in the near future. But as long as that weapon remained pointed toward the capital, the Red Army still had to station men, guns, tanks and reserves in front of it. That was part of the salient's value. It forced the Soviet Union to react. Every Soviet army held around Rzhev was an army that could not easily be sent somewhere else. Every tank formation prepared for an offensive, there was a formation unavailable for another front. Every artillery battery facing the salient was a battery that could not be used farther south. For the German High Command, holding Rzhev was therefore about more than holding ground. It was also a way of preserving psychological pressure. Moscow was not merely the political center of the Soviet Union. It was a major railway hub, a center of communication, and a symbol of national survival. As long as German forces remained near Rzhev, the memory of the previous winter's advance could not completely disappear. The people of Moscow had already seen the German army approach their capital. Soviet leaders understood that a threat left unresolved could have an influence far greater than the amount of territory it occupied. Rzhev also helped protect the center of the German front. If the Germans voluntarily abandoned the salient too soon, they would surrender more than a city. They would leave fortified positions, organized supply routes, and transportation links that had taken months to prepare. They would also allow the Red Army to move farther west, bringing Soviet forces closer to Vyazma and the important communications routes behind the German front. Ground on the Eastern Front did not matter only because of what stood upon it. It also mattered because of what it protected behind it. A village might look insignificant on a civilian map, but if it stood beside the only road trucks could use during the muddy season, it might become a position both armies were willing to fight over. The forest might appear to be empty space, but if it concealed the road to a fuel depot or railway station, it could become an essential link in an entire defensive system. Rzhev was protected by a network of positions like these. Villages became strong points. Riverbanks became blocking lines. Roads and railways allowed German forces to move from one threatened sector to another. To the soldier inside a trench, the position might be nothing more than a half-burned wooden house or a snow-covered road. To the commanders behind him, however, that position was one part of a much larger structure. If one point was lost, another line behind it might continue to fight. If one section of the front was penetrated, reserves could be sent to close the gap. If the Red Army attacked one side of the salient, the Germans could move through the territory inside their own lines and respond more quickly. That was why holding Rzhev initially seemed reasonable. The salient exposed the Germans to danger, but it also placed constant pressure on the Soviet Union. It could become a trap if both of its flanks were cut. But as long as those flanks remained intact, it forced the Red Army to fight on ground the Germans had prepared. The first lesson of Rzhev, then, was not about the amount of land an army controlled. It was about how a position could influence the choices available to the enemy. The Germans did not need to march on Moscow immediately for Rzhev to retain its value. They needed only to convince Soviet commanders that the threat had not disappeared. Yet this created a problem that the German High Command could not fully see in early 1942. A position might force the enemy to pay a price, but preserving that threat required the army holding it to continue paying as well. Before that question became urgent, The Red Army believed it had found a much simpler answer. Concentrate more men. Bring forward more artillery. Send more tanks against the salient. On paper, that superiority should have been enough to crush WWII. On the battlefield, however, that simple explanation was about to prove dangerously incomplete. When we look back at the shell-torn fields, burned-out tanks, and Soviet formations that nearly disappeared during the offensives around Rzhev, it is tempting to accept a simple explanation. The Red Army failed because it kept sending more men forward. Assault after assault. Formation after formation. Infantry advanced into German machine gun fire while commanders far behind the battlefield continued ordering attacks without regard for the cost. That image was not created entirely from fiction. The offensives at Rzhev did produce appalling casualties. Soviet units were often given objectives beyond their practical ability to reach. Some attacks continued after supplies had been lost, artillery support had become less effective, and German reserves had already begun closing the breaches. But to say that the Red Army failed simply because it threw men at machine guns is to miss the most important part of the story. The Soviet plan was not to capture every trench through an endless series of frontal attacks. On paper, the idea was far more reasonable. The Rzhev salient projected deep into the Red Army's lines, creating long flanks and depending upon roads and railways running westward. Instead of attacking only toward the city of Rzhev, Soviet forces could strike at several points along the sides of the salient. Infantry and artillery would open gaps. Tank and mobile formations would then pass through them. If those forces moved quickly enough and met behind the German front, the German Ninth Army might be separated from its roads, railways and supply depots. This was not an irrational idea. It was the basic logic of encirclement, a method that had brought victory to armies before. The problem was that a plan could appear almost perfect on a map and begin falling apart the moment it touched the real ground. An arrow on a map could cross a forest in seconds. A tank on the battlefield might spend hours searching for a road firm enough to carry its weight. A red line could pass over a river without resistance. But to a soldier, that river required a bridge. If the bridge had been destroyed, engineers had to arrive. If the engineers were delayed, the tanks had to stop. If the tanks stopped, German artillery gained more time to locate them. And if an entire formation had been forced onto a single road, one disabled vehicle might block everything behind it. The terrain around Rzhev made each of these problems more serious. Dense forests concealed the movements of both armies. Marshland restricted the number of usable routes. Rain turned the ground into mud. Winter covered mines beneath the snow and made engines, weapons, field telephones and human bodies less reliable. Even when the Red Army opened a breach, moving an entire force through that breach was a different problem. The tanks might move ahead, but infantry had to protect their flanks. Artillery had to be brought forward to new firing positions. Fuel and ammunition trucks had to find roads that remained passable. Communications had to tell headquarters where the leading units were, which formations had been stopped, and where reinforcements were needed. When one part of that system slowed down, the entire offensive began to lose its rhythm. This was what happened repeatedly during the major Soviet offensives around Rzhev. In the summer of 1942, Soviet forces made significant progress in several sectors. South of Pogorloy-Gorodishche, the German front was penetrated. During the opening hours, the situation appeared promising. Soviet infantry moved through the forward positions. Tanks began pouring into the ground beyond them. Some German formations were forced to leave defensive positions they had prepared in advance. Seen only at that moment, it might have appeared that the defensive system around Rzhev was finally beginning to collapse. But a breakthrough was not a victory. A breakthrough created only a brief period in which the attacker had to move faster than the defender could react. At Rzhev, that period often disappeared very quickly. Roads became congested. Tanks moved ahead of the infantry. Units lost contact with one another. Artillery could not always shift its fire quickly enough to support formations that had advanced deep into the German rear. Meanwhile, the Germans used the roads behind their front to move troops toward the most dangerous sectors. They did not need to destroy the entire Soviet penetration at once. They only needed to slow it. Hold one village for a few more hours. Block one bridge. Counterattack one exposed flank. Every hour lost allowed another German anti-tank gun to be brought into position. Another battalion could arrive to strengthen the defense. Another minefield could be placed across the road the Soviet tanks needed to use. For the Soviet commanders, this created a brutal choice. Stopping to reorganize meant giving the Germans time to recover. But continuing forward before the infantry, artillery, fuel, and ammunition had caught up might leave the leading formations isolated. The commanders had to choose between losing speed and losing cohesion. Either choice could end in failure. None of this removes responsibility from the Soviet command. Many orders were based on expectations that were no longer realistic. Reports from the battlefield were sometimes delayed or inaccurate. Some commanders continued demanding advances because they believed the Germans were one final blow away from collapse, even while the soldiers at the front could see the enemy's defenses becoming stronger again. Rigid command practices, political pressure, and the fear of reporting failure all helped increase the cost. But Rzhev cannot be understood through cruelty alone. It was also the story of an army attempting to conduct complicated mobile operations while its communications, logistics, and coordination had not yet caught up with the ambition of its plans. The Red Army could concentrate more soldiers. It could bring forward more tanks. It could fire more artillery shells. But if all that strength did not reach the correct place, at the correct moment, and in the correct sequence, superiority on paper could become confusion on the battlefield. That is why the simple explanation is not enough. Soviet soldiers did not fail only because they encountered German machine guns. They failed because behind those machine guns stood a system designed to continue functioning after its first offensive line had been penetrated. A system that used time, terrain, interior routes, and mobile reserves as weapons of their own. The Red Army had learned how to open the door. What it had not yet defeated was the entire machine waiting behind it. The Red Army had already proven that it could break through the first German positions around Rzhev. Artillery could tear apart barbed wire. Infantry could overrun forward trenches. Tanks could cross shattered defenses and move into the open ground beyond them. But what repeatedly drained the momentum from the Soviet offensives was not a single trench line. It was the entire system waiting behind it. The man most closely associated with organizing and directing that system was Walter Model, commander of the German 9th Army. Model earned a reputation as a determined defensive commander who frequently appeared in threatened sectors, demanded direct reports, and pressured his formations to hold. But it would be a mistake to explain the survival of Rzhev through the personality of one general. No commander could personally stop a tank, protect a bridge, or hold a village beneath an artillery barrage. The strength of the German defense came from the way many smaller elements were connected. The trenches were only the first layer. Behind them stood fortified villages, anti-tank positions, minefields, secondary firing lines and roads that allowed reserves to move toward the most threatened sectors. A small village could become a fortress. Wooden houses were reinforced with earth and timber. Shelters were dug beneath floors and foundations. Machine guns were placed to control roads, forest clearings, and the narrow approaches Soviet infantry would be forced to use. Anti-tank guns did not always wait at the forward edge. They could be concealed behind a slope, inside an orchard, or among ruined buildings, allowing Soviet tanks to pass the first position before opening fire against their thinner sides. A strong point did not always have to survive forever. It only had to survive long enough. Long enough to slow the attacking formation. Long enough to force Soviet artillery to shift its fire. Long enough for German commanders to identify the main direction of the offensive. And most importantly, long enough for the reserves to arrive. Time therefore became a weapon. A village held for several additional hours could matter far more than its small size suggested on a map. During those hours, an infantry battalion might be brought forward. An anti-tank battery could change position. An armored formation could prepare a counterattack. A new defensive line could begin forming farther back. When the Red Army finally captured the village, it might discover that the reward was a collection of burning houses, shell-cratered roads, and another German line already taking shape ahead. This made the earliest battlefield reports dangerously easy to misunderstand. A Soviet formation might report that it had broken through the forward line and advanced deep into the German position. That report might be entirely accurate, but headquarters still needed to know how wide the breach was, whether both flanks had been secured, whether the artillery could continue providing support, whether the supply road behind the advance remained open, and most importantly, whether the Germans ahead were truly collapsing or merely withdrawing into positions prepared in advance. Model understood that defense did not require every soldier to die in the first trench. A rigid line could be penetrated at a single point, leaving the forces beside the breach in danger of encirclement. Instead, the Germans attempted to preserve a structure that could continue operating even after part of it had been lost. Some positions had to be defended at almost any cost. Some needed only to delay the enemy. Some formations could withdraw to avoid being cut off. Reserves were kept behind the line so they could respond to the greatest danger rather than being spread evenly across the entire front. This did not mean the system always worked perfectly. Reports could still arrive too late. Orders might no longer match the situation by the time they reached the battlefield. Reserves could be committed too early or arrive too late. Many German units held their positions while exhausted, under strength, and short of ammunition. But compared with a defense that depended entirely upon its forward trenches, this system was better able to absorb a blow. One of Germany's greatest advantages at Rzhev came from the routes inside the salient. The Red Army had to attack from the outside. Its advancing formations were often separated by forests, rivers, marshes, and a limited number of usable roads. Two units might appear close together on a headquarters map. On the ground, however, they could be divided by a roadless forest, an unbridged river, or a strip of land covered by German fire. The Germans, meanwhile, could move behind their own front. They knew the roads. They had prepared the junctions. They could transfer a formation from a relatively quiet sector toward a new breach without first crossing their own defensive system. This was the advantage of interior lines. In simple terms, the Germans could move through the inside of the salient, while Soviet forces had to work around it or force their way in from the outside. This did not make the Germans faster under every condition. Mud could still trap German trucks. Snow could still stop engines. Soviet artillery could still destroy bridges and road junctions. But while the system remained functional, it allowed the Germans to concentrate forces at one point faster than the Red Army could widen and secure its penetration. That was why an offensive that began with overwhelming strength could quickly become a race between two clocks. The first clock measured how long the Soviets needed to move tanks, infantry, artillery, fuel, and ammunition through the breach. The second measured how long the Germans needed to bring in reserves and close it. If the Red Army won that race, the salient might be cut apart. If the Germans won, the Soviet forces that had advanced deepest could find themselves attacked from both sides. Model and his subordinate commanders did not have to prevent every Soviet advance. They only had to make each advance consume more time. A minefield forced the tanks to stop. An anti-tank gun forced a formation to spread out. The demolished bridge created a traffic jam. A village that held through the afternoon allowed reserves to arrive after dark. Each obstacle by itself might not stop a major offensive, but connected together, they could take away the most valuable possession of an attacking army: momentum. A breakthrough force could not afford to pause for long. It had to keep moving before the defender understood what was happening. It had to capture roads, bridges, and junctions before they could be defended. It had to widen its flanks before the forces behind it were compressed into a narrow corridor. Otherwise, what had begun as a spear pointed into the enemy's rear could become an arm caught in a closing door. That was what made the defenses around Rzhev far more dangerous than the image of a row of German soldiers sitting in trenches. The forward line could be penetrated. A village could be lost. A formation could be forced to retreat. But if reports continued to move, the roads behind the front remained open, and reserves could still maneuver. The system had not truly been defeated. The lesson is not that Model was an unbeatable commander. He made mistakes, demanded that his soldiers endure severe losses, and depended upon a defensive structure that had been prepared before the Soviet attack began. The real lesson is that a strong defensive system does not attempt to hold every yard of ground at the same price. It decides which positions must be held, which positions need only delay the enemy, and when reserves must be committed to turn a dangerous breakthrough into an increasingly narrow corridor. But even the strongest system had limits. It could survive only if the reserves arrived in time, if the roads behind the front remained usable, and if the attacker did not move faster than the defender could react. During the summer of 1942, the Red Army created a moment when all of those conditions nearly failed. The German line had been broken. The opening was there. Soviet formations were moving through it. And for several brief hours, it appeared that Model's reserves might arrive too late. For several brief hours in the summer of 1942, the defensive system around Rzhev appeared to be coming apart. Soviet artillery struck the forward positions. Infantry crossed the shattered trenches. In several sectors, German troops were forced from their defenses as Red Army tanks moved through the openings behind them. Beyond the first line, the road towards Sykioka seemed to be appearing. If Soviet mobile forces could reach that vital junction, the route sustaining the eastern portion of the salient would be threatened. Rzhev might not need to be captured through a direct assault. The German Ninth Army might be forced to withdraw, or face the danger of being cut off. This was the moment the entire Soviet plan had been waiting for. The door was open, but it would not remain open forever. In mobile warfare, A breakthrough is not merely a gap in an enemy line. It is also a race against time. The attacker must push forces through before the defender understands the full scale of the danger. Tanks must seize bridges before they are demolished. Infantry must widen the flanks before the defender can counterattack. Artillery must move forward to continue providing support. Fuel, ammunition, and food must follow the formations advancing into the enemy rear. When one part of that chain slows down, the entire offensive begins to lose its rhythm. Around Rzhev, almost anything could consume time. After the artillery preparation, the ground was no longer a flat surface. It became a broken landscape of shell holes, collapsed trenches, destroyed vehicles, and tangled barbed wire. Small roads that had never been designed for a large mechanized force became crowded with trucks, guns, and tanks attempting to pass one another. One vehicle trapped in the mud could stop everything behind it. One weak or demolished bridge could force engineers to work while German artillery continued firing. One apparently unimportant crossroads had become packed with vehicles because no formation was entirely certain which road it had been assigned. From headwaters, the spear might still appear to be moving. From inside, tanks sitting behind a column of stalled vehicles, the operation might already have stopped. South of Pogorloy, British Soviet forces achieved a dangerous penetration during the summer offensive. Forward positions were overrun, and during the opening phase, the advance toward the Vyazma River and Zykoka created a genuine threat to the defensive system of the Ninth Army. Yet the Germans continued holding important positions on the shoulders of the breach, preventing the corridor from being wound quickly enough. That gave them time to bring in forces, reorganize the defense, and turn a large opening on the map into an increasingly restricted passage on the battlefield. To the crew of the Soviet tank moving westward, those early hours might have felt like the beginning of victory. The first trenches were behind them. Several villages had been taken. Bemzolas had been captured or seen withdrawing. The order remained the same: keep moving, do not stop, do not give the enemy time to recover. But the tank crew could see only what stood directly ahead. They did not know whether the infantry behind them had been stopped by a surviving strong point. They did not know whether the formations on either flank were advancing at the same speed. They did not know whether the fuel trucks were only a few miles away or trapped beside a destroyed bridge, and they could not know whether the Germans appearing in front of them were the remains of a retreating force or fresh reserves arriving to close the breach. This was the difference between tactical success and operational success. A battalion could capture a village, a tank brigade could move deep through the front, Badwaters could draw promising arrows across a map. But to win the larger operation, those separate successes had to remain connected. Infantry had to hold the ground the tanks had crossed. Artillery had to protect the leading formations. Units on both sides had to widen the corridor. Reserves had to be committed at the correct moment, neither too early nor too late. Above all, headquarters had to understand the situation faster than the situation was changing. That was extraordinarily difficult at Rzhev. Reports from the front often took time to reach senior commanders. Artillery fire cut telephone lines. Radios were not always dependable. Liaison officers sometimes had to travel along roads under fire merely to deliver reports that were already outdated when they arrived. One unit might report that little organized resistance remained ahead. Several hours later, German reserves could be standing in that same area. A commander might order more tanks through the gap. By the time the order was carried out, the corridor might already be narrowing, with German anti-tank guns positioned along its sides. No single delay necessarily destroyed the offensive, but small delays accumulated. An hour at a bridge, an hour at a village, an hour refueling, an hour waiting for new orders. By the end of the day, the leading formations might still be advancing, but the strategic opportunity was already moving beyond their reach. The Germans did not need to recapture all the ground they had lost immediately. They only needed to protect the points controlling the corridor. A village on the northern shoulder, a strip of high ground to the south, a bridge or road junction farther behind the front. Holding those positions meant the Soviets had to continue feeding troops through a route increasingly vulnerable to artillery fire and counterattack. The farther the spearhead moved, the greater the distance from its supplies. Its flanks became longer. The number of usable roads became smaller, and every supply column became easier to identify and attack. This was when the strength of the breakthrough began turning into a weakness. The leading tanks had been sent forward to create confusion in the German rear. Now they risked becoming separated from the forces that sustained them. They still possessed firepower. They still had armor. They might still capture more ground. But a tank could not fight for long without fuel. It could not hold a large forest without infantry. It could not repair itself when its engine failed. And it could not protect a supply road stretching for miles behind it. The Soviet troops therefore faced a choice with no completely safe answer. If they continued moving, they might reach vital objectives before the Germans could defend them. But they might also advance too far and become separated from the rear. If they stopped to wait for infantry, artillery, and supplies, they could build a more secure position. But every minute spent waiting was another minute given to Model's reserves. Neither choice was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely safe. That is what makes the story at Rzhev more painful than a simple explanation based on incompetence. Soviet commanders did not always fail because they could not recognize the problem. Sometimes they understood it clearly. They simply lacked the time, information, or coordination needed to solve every part of it at once. An offensive required speed, but speed stretched the supply system. It required concentration, but concentration created congestion on narrow roads. It required tanks to move deep, but those tanks needed infantry beside them. It required decisive orders, but the more rigid the orders became, the harder they were to adapt when the battlefield changed. Meanwhile, the Germans only needed to gain time. Every additional hour they held the shoulders of the breach was another hour in which the opening could not be widened. Every small counterattack forced Soviet formations to turn back toward their supply routes. Every village that continued resisting required infantry and artillery to stop and deal with it instead of advancing farther. The struggle was no longer only about which side possessed more soldiers or tanks. It became a question of which side could preserve its tempo longer. During the following days, the Soviet advance slowed. The Germans moved additional forces into the threatened sectors. New anti-tank positions appeared. Counterattacks struck the sides of the corridor. Formations that had seemed to be driving toward the German rear were forced to turn and defend the roads they had used to get there. The opportunity did not disappear in one dramatic moment. There was no single explosion announcing that the offensive had failed. It was taken away 1 hour at a time. A road blocked. A bridge destroyed. A formation arriving late. A German reserve appearing earlier than expected, until what had begun as a breakthrough became a narrow projection where the attacker was fighting merely to remain connected with the rear. That was the central lesson of the summer of 1942. The Red Army had proven that the defenses around Rzhev could be penetrated. It had pushed German troops out of prepared positions. It had created a threat serious enough to force the headquarters of the Ninth Army into an urgent response. But it had not transformed penetration into collapse. The Soviets had opened the door, then watched it slowly close before the rest of the army could pass through. Yet this failure did not end the hopes of the Soviet High Command. Instead, it seemed to offer a tempting lesson. Prepare more carefully. Concentrate stronger mobile forces. Attack from more directions at the same time. and during the next attempt, give the Germans no time to close the door. A few months later, the Red Army would try again with an even greater operation. Its name was Operation Mars. It was designed to close the trap around the Germans. But this time, the forces moving through the openings would discover that they were entering a different trap of their own. The failure of the summer offensive left the Soviet High Command with a tempting lesson. The defenses around Rzhev were not impossible to penetrate. The earlier breaches had simply been too narrow, the advancing forces had not been coordinated closely enough, and the Germans had still possessed enough time to move their reserves. So during the next attempt, the Red Army would not strike at only 1 or 2 points. It would attack the salient from several directions at once. It would force the German Ninth Army to confront more crises than it could possibly solve. And if the Soviet spearheads met in the German rear, the entire Rzhev salient could close like an enormous pocket. The plan was given the name Operation Mars. In late November of 1942, while the world's attention was turning toward the crisis at Stalingrad, Soviet artillery opened fire around Rzhev. From the east, forces of the Western Front attacked across the Vyazma River sector, aiming towards Sykioka and the vital communications routes behind the German line. From the west, formations of the Kalinin front advanced toward Bili. Additional attacks were launched through the Luchiza Valley and against the northern face of the salient. On the map, the arrows pointed toward one another. The objective was not merely to capture another group of villages. It was to break the German front at several points, send mobile formations deep into the rear, and destroy the Ninth Army before it could escape the trap. It was an ambitious plan, and during the opening hours, parts of it worked. Despite snow, fog, and heavily forested terrain, Soviet troops penetrated the German front in several sectors. Near the Vyazma River, tanks, cavalry, and motorized infantry moved through narrow breaches. Around Bili, Soviet mobile forces also advanced behind the German forward positions. German units were forced from trenches. Communication lines were cut. Some headquarters had to move. The first reports appeared to show exactly what Soviet commanders had hoped to see. The line had been penetrated, the mobile forces were advancing, the German rear layered. But as in the summer offensive, one important question soon emerged. How far the leading formations had advanced was not the only measurement that mattered. The more important question was how wide the road remained behind them. Breakthrough force can be imagined as the point of a spit. The point may penetrate deeper, but if the shaft behind it is too thin, the defender does not have to stop the spade itself. He only has to break the connection between the point and the hand holding it. That was the trap hidden inside the breakthroughs of Operation Mars. To encircle the Germans, the Soviet mobile forces had to advance quickly and deeper, but the deeper they moved, the more they depended upon a small number of roads, bridges, and openings behind them. Those corridors had to carry everything: fuel for the tanks, ammunition for the guns, food for the soldiers, ambulances moving wounded men toward the rear, mechanics, spare parts, radios, and orders from headquarters. As long as the corridor remained open, the spared could continue living. If it closed, the force sent forward to encircle the enemy might itself become encircled. Near the Vyazma River, the danger quickly became clear. Soviet mobile formations had passed through the first German line, but the German positions on the shoulders of the breach had not been completely eliminated. Tanks and cavalry continued westward, while infantry behind them struggled to widen the corridor. German anti-tank guns were moved toward the limited roads that vehicles could use. Artillery struck river crossings and areas where Soviet traffic had begun to concentrate. The German counterattacks did not always aim directly at the Soviet formations that had advanced farther. Instead, they struck the shoulders of the penetration. Their purpose was to squeeze the passage behind the spear. For the crew of a Soviet tank at the front, the battlefield might still have looked like an offensive. The orders told them to keep moving west, lay another village, another forest, or another anti-tank position, but behind them, the story was changed. Fuel trucks had to use the same narrow road. Wounded soldiers were moving in the opposite direction from the reinforcements. Disabled tanks remained beside the track. Vehicles gathered at the river crossings, and on both sides of the corridor, German troops were moving closer. The soldier at the front could not see the entire track. He knew only that the fuel level was falling. The ammunition racks were no longer as full as they had been that morning. morning, the radio carried short and sometimes conflicting instructions: continue the advance, turn back and protect the supply route, hold the position until the infantry arrives. But no one could say with certainty how far away that infantry might be. Around Bali, the danger became ever more visible. Soviet mechanized formations penetrated through the forested region and advanced into the German rear. On the map, the thrust looked promising. If it continued and connected with other Soviet forces, the German positions around Bali might be cut off, opening the way toward the deeper part of the Said. But Bali itself and the surviving German strongpoints around it continued to delay the Soviet advance. There were fusible roads through the forests, no mud, and damaged vehicles, slow movement. The leading units moved beyond the reliable support of their artillery and supply columns. Meanwhile, armored reserves were arriving. Once again, the Germans did not need to drive every Soviet formation back immediately. They concentrated on the corridor. They attacked the roads. They struck the areas connecting the mobile forces in front with the infantry and supplies behind them. The door the Red Army had opened began to narrow. This was the moment when Soviet commanders faced a painful decision. They could order the mobile formations to stop and turn back to protect the corridor. But doing so meant surrendering the speed required to complete the encirclement. They could also continue sending tanks and soldiers through the breach, hoping the weight of additional forces would overcome German resistance. But that meant placing more men and vehicles inside a corridor that was already being squeezed. In theory, reinforcements might save the breakthrough. In practice, they might also create greater congestion, consume more fuel, and provide German artillery with more targets. There was no single moment when Operation Mars suddenly changed from an opportunity into a disaster. The transformation occurred one step at a time. The village on the flank was not captured on schedule. An infantry regiment arrived late. A bridge was damaged. A German armored formation appeared where it had not been expected. One Soviet unit continued advancing because it believed the formation beside it was doing the same, when in reality that neighboring formation had been stopped in the forest. Each problem might have been manageable by itself, but all of them were happening together. That was what made a great operation so difficult to control. Headquarters could see the advancing arrows on its maps, but the map could not show exactly how much fuel remained in each tank. It could not show that a road had been blocked by a disabled vehicle. It could not measure the exhaustion of a battalion that had fought through the snow for several days without proper rest. And it could not instantly erase an arrow drawn during planning, even when the formation represented by that arrow no longer possessed the strength to advance. Pressure from above made the decisions even more difficult. Operation Mars had been prepared with great objectives. Large forces had been concentrated. Supplies, artillery, ammunition, tanks, and human lives had already been invested in the plan. When an operation of that scale began to struggle, stopping was never merely a simple military decision. It might be interpreted as a lack of determination, as the abandonment of an opportunity, as an admission that earlier reports had been too optimistic. The attacks therefore continued. Additional forces were committed. Exhausted formations received orders to try again. The remaining operational tanks were gathered for new attempts to widen the corridor or break through the German counterattacks. But the more forces sent through an unstable opening, the greater the cost if that opening closed. Eventually, in several sectors, the Germans succeeded in cutting the routes behind the Soviet spearheads. Formations that had advanced in the hope of encircling the Ninth Army now had to fight their way out of the ground they had just captured. Tanks without fuel were abandoned or destroyed. Infantry searched for routes through forests and snow. Small groups attempted to hold roads in darkness so that other soldiers could escape. The offensive was no longer moving towards Sykioka, Bali, or the German rear. The immediate objective had become the opening of a road home. This was not a secret trap that the Germans had prepared perfectly in advance. The Germans had also been surprised. Some sectors of their front had faced a genuine danger of collapse. Reserves had to be committed under emergency conditions. The outcome might have been different if the Soviet penetrations had been widened faster, or if the separate spearheads had connected before the Germans recovered. But once those opportunities were lost, Model's defensive system did what it had been designed to do. It survived the first blow. It held the shoulders of the breaches. It moved reserves toward the decisive points. Then it transformed the depth of the Soviet advance into isolation. Historians continue to debate the precise place of Operation Mars within Soviet strategy. In late 1942, some interpreted as a major offensive conducted alongside the counter-offensive at Stalingrad. Other explanations emphasize its role in holding German forces in the center of the front and preventing them from being used elsewhere. But whatever position Mars occupied within the larger strategic plan, the soldiers who participated in it were not fighting a symbolic diversion. They received real objectives, they attacked real defenses, and they suffered real losses in a serious attempt to destroy the German forces inside the Rzhev. Operation Mars ended without destroying the Nithani. The Soviet spares did not meet. Vyazma was not cut from the German defensive system. The formations that penetrated deepest were either forced to withdraw, surrounded, and severely damaged. The plan to form an enormous pocket around the Germans had failed. Instead, smaller pockets formed around the leading Soviet forces. That was the operation's most painful powder, to create an encirclement. The Soviets had to send their mobile forces deep into the German rear, but those formations moved forward before the corridors behind them were secured. To preserve the offensive's momentum, more forces had to be committed, but every additional formation increased the number of men dependent upon an opening that was becoming narrow. Operation Mars had been designed to pose a trap around the Germans. In the end, the shape of its own breakthroughs created small traps within the larger operation. Yet the story did not end as a simple German victory. The Ninth Army had suffered. The defensive system had held. The Ruhr salient remained in German hands, but to achieve that result, German reserves had been thrown into a furious struggle among forests and snow, and it had been forced to counterattack repeatedly. Tanks, artillery, fuel, and soldiers who could not easily be replaced had been consumed. Model had saved Ruhr, but every time the salient was rescued, Germany increased the price it would have to pay to continue holding it. After Operation Mars, the question was no longer simply whether the Germans could defend Ruhr. The deeper question was how long they could continue defending it, and whether an expensive defensive victory was still a victory when the same position had to be saved again and again. Operation Mars had failed to destroy the German Army. The Soviet spares had not joined. The breakthrough corridors had narrowed. The mobile formations that advanced deepest had been forced to withdraw, fight their way out, or abandon vehicles along the snow-covered roads. When the fighting temporarily split, the Ruhr salient remained in German hands. On the map, the result appeared here. The Germans had held their position. The Red Army had failed to achieve its objective. Water Model and the Ninth Army seemed to have won another defensive victory, but an unbroken line was not the same as a line that had been oppressed. And after the battles of late 1942, the cost of holding Rzhev was becoming more difficult to ignore. German losses were not equal to Soviet losses in absolute sense. Many Soviet attacks had been repulsed, a far greater cost to the attacker than to the defender. Prepared positions, anti-tank guns, machine guns, mines, and the movement of mobile reserve allowed the Germans to inflict severe casualties while preserving much of their defensive system. But a favourable exchange of casualties did not make German losses unborn. For an army, the value of a soldier is made by more than a number in a rebel. It is also made by how easily the soldier can be replaced. The German infantry squad that lost several veterans might still exist on paper, but the replacements would not immediately possess the experience of men who had been fighting since the summer of 1940. An anti-tank crew could receive new personnel, but the coordination developed through months of combat could not be recruited by an order. A company commander could be replaced, yet the new officer needed time to learn the terrain, understand his men, and recognize the routes Soviet forces might use during the next attack. At Rzhev, the Germans were not losing any manpower, they were losing experience, they were losing key. They were losing soldiers who could react almost instinctively when telephone lines were cut, when headquarters lost contact, or when Soviet tanks suddenly emerged from a forest. Those losses were difficult to see on a map. The symbol representing a division might remain in the same place. The formation's name might not change. But inside that symbol, companies had grown smaller. Platoons had been combined. New soldiers were learning how to survive while the battle continued around them. The salient remained intact. The force holding it was slowly being worn down. Every time the Red Army opened another major offensive, the Ninth Army had to find the strength to stop it. Reserves were moved from quiet sectors toward the places where the line was shaking. Tanks were committed to counterattacks against the breakthrough corridors. Artillery ammunition had to be redirected toward new crisis points. Trucks carrying fuel, wounded soldiers, and reinforcements traveled along roads already damaged by mud, snow, and shellfire. The interior routes of the salient had given the Germans an important advantage. But those routes did not operate for free. Every time an armored formation moved from one sector to another, it consumed fuel. Every time an artillery battery changed position, tractors, ammunition, and men had to move with it. Every time a division left a quiet area to rescue a threatened breach, the sector it had abandoned became weaker. Model's defensive system worked by concentrating strength at the most dangerous point. To do that, however, he had to keep taking strength from somewhere else. This was the difference between a strong defensive line and a truly secure one. A strong line could defeat today's attack. A secure line had to do so without damaging the army's ability to fight tomorrow. Rzhev increasingly belonged to the first category. It remained strong. But each time it was saved, it required another portion of the reserves, another supply column, and more soldiers Germany could not easily replace. Imagine a German infantry company after months of fighting around one small village. On a map, the unit held only a short section of the front. For the men inside it, however, the battle never completely stopped. During the day, they repaired trenches and replaced communication wire. At night, they patrolled among the forests and snow. When Soviet artillery opened fire, they waited inside their shelters, uncertain whether the attack would fall on their position or several miles away. When the assault came, they had to hold long enough for the reserves to arrive. If they survived, they repaired the trenches again. They buried their dead. They received several replacement soldiers who did not know the ground. Then they waited for the next attack. The position could remain uncaptured. The men defending it could still be consumed. That was the price hidden inside the phrase the line held. The word suggested stability. In reality, holding could be a continuous process of losing men, losing equipment, and losing freedom of action. German counterattacks at Rzhev still succeeded. But the armored units used there could not be present on another battlefield at the same time. The guns defending Sykioka could not simultaneously be sent south. The trains delivering ammunition to the 9th Army could not serve another formation during that same journey. Not every unit at Rzhev could simply have been transferred to Stalingrad. Distance, rail capacity, time, the condition of the formations, and the requirements of the entire front made troop movements far more complicated than shifting symbols across a map. It would therefore be an exaggeration to claim that Rzhev directly withheld one specific force that would certainly have saved the German 6th Army. What can be said more carefully is that the salient tied down a substantial part of German strength in the central sector. It demanded attention. It consumed reserves. And it reduced the freedom German commanders possessed to use their forces elsewhere. This was one of the broader purposes of military pressure. An offensive did not always need to capture its final objective to create an effect. If it forced the enemy to commit reserves, if it compelled him to defend an extended front, if it consumed ammunition, fuel, and experienced soldiers, then even a failed offensive could influence the choices remaining to the defender. That did not transform Operation Mars into a secret Soviet victory. The Red Army had failed to complete the encirclement. Soviet formations had suffered terrible losses. The soldiers trapped inside the breakthrough corridors received no comfort from the knowledge that German reserves were also being consumed. An operational failure remained an operational failure. But the failure of the attacker did not automatically mean the defender had emerged unchanged. Both statements could be true. The Red Army had failed to break the salient, and the Germans had been forced to pay an increasing price to preserve it. This was the paradox at the center of Rzhev. Every defensive victory strengthened the belief that the position could continue to be held. Yet every victory also reduced the strength available to defend it during the next attack. The survival of the line created a reason to remain. The cost of keeping it alive created a reason to leave. For most of 1942, the German High Command could still believe that this exchange was worthwhile. The salient continued placing pressure on Moscow. It continued fixing Soviet forces in the central sector. The Ninth Army continued proving that it could stop major offensives. And after Operation Mars, the Germans possessed additional evidence that their defensive system could survive an enormous attempt at encirclement. But there was a difference between asking, can we hold this position, and asking, is this position still worth holding? The first question was tactical. The second was strategic. At Rzhev, the answer to the tactical question still appeared to be yes, the Germans could continue to hold. But elsewhere on the Eastern Front, a disaster was changing the value of every reserve, every mile of defensive line, and every position projecting deep into enemy territory. At Stalingrad, a German army was surrounded. Germany's allied armies in the south had been shattered. The entire southern wing of the front had entered a crisis. Suddenly, the ability to hold Rzhev was no longer enough to prove that Germany should remain there. The salient had not been broken, but the strategic world around it was beginning to collapse, and when Stalingrad changed the war, it would also change the meaning of Rzhev. Nothing at Rzhev changed in a single night. The German trenches were still there. Fortified villages continued controlling the roads. The Ninth Army still held most of the defensive system that had defeated the Red Army's offensives. Operation Mars had ended without destroying Walter Model's forces. Rzhev remained in German hands. But hundreds of miles to the south, a disaster had changed the value of every division, every supply train, and every mile of front across the Eastern Front. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army had been encircled. The Allied armies protecting its flanks had been broken. An operation intended to deliver victory on the Volga had become a crisis threatening the entire southern wing of the German front. Suddenly, the question at Rzhev was no longer simply, "Can the Germans hold the salient?" They had just proven that they could. The new question was, under these conditions, is the salient still worth holding? It was a small change in the wording of the question, but it produced an entirely different answer. During most of 1942, Rzhev still represented a powerful forward position. It stood close to Moscow. It compelled the Red Army to concentrate large forces in the central sector. It protected the routes leading toward Vyazma, and its very existence forced Soviet commanders to consider the possibility that Germany might someday use the area for another offensive. After Stalingrad, however, the German army was no longer fighting the same kind of war. Its offensive strength had declined. Reserves had become more valuable. Gaps in the front had become more dangerous. And a salient projecting deep into enemy territory was no longer merely a weapon. It was also a commitment that might be cut off. This does not mean that Stalingrad directly defeated the Germans at Rzhev. There was no simple line connecting the two battlefields. Not every division holding Rzhev could have been moved south in time to rescue the Sixth Army. The distances were enormous, railway capacity was limited, many formations had already been worn down and needed replacements before they could be used elsewhere. Moving an army was not the same as dragging a symbol from one side of a map to another. It would therefore be an exaggeration to claim that Rzhev certainly withheld the force that curve changed the result at Stalingrad, but Stalingrad changed Rzhev in a deeper way. It changed the calculation of the entire war. Before the German commanders could look at the salient and see the pressure it placed upon the Soviet Union. After Stalingrad, they had to see the number of troops required to protect its long flanks. Before the crisis, its proximity to Moscow made it appear to be a possible base for the future. After Stalingrad, the depth of the salient made it look like an arm extended too far forward. Before the crisis, every defeated Soviet offensive proved that the position could be held. After Stalingrad, every new offensive became a reminder that the Ninth Army might one day have to fight while threatened with encirclement. Holding a large salient required a much longer front than defending a straighter line farther west. Every bend on the map required soldiers. Every road leading into the salient had to be protected. Every bridge, railway station and fuel depot had to remain operational. Reserves had to be ready to move from one face of the salient to another whenever the Red Army attacked. If the front was shortened, the same number of soldiers could be concentrated more heavily Rzhev, and formations could be withdrawn from the line to rest, rebuild, or become operational reserves. Supply routes would become shorter, headquarters would have fewer vulnerable sectors to mount, and the danger of a large force becoming trapped inside an encirclement would be reduced. After the disaster unfolding at Stalingrad, these advantages were no longer theoretical. The German army had just seen what happened when a major force remained inside an exposed position after its flanks had collapsed. The Sixth Army had not withdrawn while an opportunity still existed. Orders to hold transformed a military position into a trap. The land routes were cut. The airlift could not meet the army's needs. And every day of delay reduced the possibility of escape. Rzhev was not Stalingrad. The terrain was different. The distances were different. The forces and defensive system were different. The Ninth Army had not been surrounded. Its roads toward the west remained open. Model could still maneuver and counterattack. But for that reason, the German command still possessed a choice the Sixth Army had already lost. It could leave before the trap closed. That was the crucial difference. A withdrawal before encirclement might preserve an army. A withdrawal after encirclement might no longer be possible. At Rzhev, the Germans did not have to wait for the Red Army finally to connect its spearheads behind the Ninth Army. They did not have to prove once again that Model's defensive system could withstand another great offensive. They already possessed that evidence. But the evidence answered only a tactical question. It did not answer whether Germany still had the strength to defend every position it remained capable of holding. After Stalingrad, the answer was becoming clear. Germany needed reserves. Not merely formations that continued to exist on paper, but units that could be removed from the front, reinforced, reorganized, and sent toward new crises. It needed tanks that were not forced to counterattack around the same villages again and again. It needed artillery that could be concentrated for future operations. It needed a shorter front that was easier to supply and offered fewer opportunities for the Red Army to create major encirclements. Rzhev stood against each of those requirements. The salient still possessed value, but value could no longer be considered alone. It had to be weighed against risk, and the balance had changed. This is also where another attractive but overly simple explanation must be rejected. It is reasonable to say that the Soviet offensives helped make Rzhev expensive and dangerous to hold. They forced the Ninth Army to commit reserves. They wore down the defending formations. They demonstrated that the salient's flanks could be penetrated and that a more successful Soviet operation in the future might create a serious danger. But it would be wrong to describe the later German withdrawal as proof of a hidden Soviet victory at Rzhev. The immediate Soviet encirclement plans had failed. Operation Mars did not destroy the Ninth Army. The Red Army soldiers lost inside the collapsing breakthrough corridors could not be transformed into victors simply because of what happened several months later. The truth was more difficult. Soviet pressure increased the cost of remaining. Stalingrad changed Germany's willingness and ability to accept that cost, and Germany's new strategic needs made withdrawal from the salient more reasonable than continuing to defend it. There was no single cause. It was the combination of attrition at Rzhev, crisis across the wider front, and a growing recognition that the German army could no longer hold every position merely because that position had once been valuable. To the soldiers standing in the trenches around Rzhev, that change might not have been immediately visible. They still patrolled the same roads. They still watched the snow-covered forests. They still repaired their fortifications after each artillery barrage. They might have believed that Operation Mars had just proven the salient could not be broken. But inside the headquarters behind them, the maps were beginning to be read differently. The question was no longer only how many troops were required to hold Rzhev. It was how many troops could be recovered by leaving it. The question was no longer only which ground would be surrendered. It was how much shorter the new front might become. The question was no longer only how the Red Army would celebrate the withdrawal. It was whether the Ninth Army could be saved from becoming another Stalingrad. This was a difficult decision for a regime that repeatedly turned the holding of ground into a symbol of will. Withdrawal could appear to be an admission of defeat. It meant surrendering a city that so many soldiers had died to defend. It removed the threat that had once pointed toward Moscow, and it offered the Red Army a propaganda victory it had not achieved through direct assault. But strategy cannot be built only from the memory of what has already been paid. The number of men who died to hold a position does not automatically prove that more men should die to keep holding it. That is one of war's cruelest lessons. A position may once have been important. It may once have been worth fighting for. It may once have helped an army achieve its purpose. But when conditions change, the past cannot permanently decide the future. By early 1943, the Rzhev salient had still not been defeated on the battlefield. Yet the purpose that had once made it worth holding was beginning to disappear. The threat to Moscow was no longer as realistic as it had once appeared. The danger of encirclement was becoming more serious. The need to shorten the front had become urgent. And the formations tied down inside the salient had become more valuable than the ground they were defending. Rzhev remained tactically strong. Strategically, it had become weak. That was what Stalingrad changed. Not a single bullet fired at Rzhev. Not a trench immediately lost. Not a final Soviet attack that shattered the Ninth Army. Instead, the disaster in the south changed the answer to a basic question, which mattered more: holding the salient, or saving the army holding it. The Germans had not been driven from there, but they had begun to understand that remaining might now be more dangerous than leaving, and their final operation there would not be another defense. It would be a carefully prepared withdrawal intended to remove an entire army from the salient before the Red Army could transform it into the trap it had been trying to create for more than a year. By early 1943, the Germans still held Rzhev. The Red Army had not broken the salient. Operation Mars had failed. The German Ninth Army still possessed open roads toward the west. Its defensive system remained functional, and most of Walter Model's main force had not been encircled. By the simplest measure of battle, the Germans had won. They held the ground their enemy wanted. They defeated major offensive. They prevented the Soviet spearheads from joining in their rear. Yet only a few months after that defensive victory, the Germans began leaving Rzhev, not because one final Soviet attack had shattered their trenches, not because the Ninth Army had suddenly collapsed, and not because the Red Army had finally closed the trap it had pursued for more than a year. The Germans withdrew because they had decided that the salient was no longer worth holding. The withdrawal was given the name Operation Büffel. Its purpose was not to capture more territory. It was not to destroy another enemy army. It was to remove most of the Ninth Army from the salient before the Red Army understood the full scale of the movement and organized a decisive pursuit. For an army that had spent months transforming Rzhev into a fortress, this was an entirely different kind of operation. Defense required soldiers to remain in place. Withdrawal required hundreds of thousands of men, vehicles, guns, supply units, and stores to move according to a carefully controlled schedule. A great retreat could not begin with a simple order: move west. The roads had to be assigned. The bridges had to remain under control. The formations in the rear needed to know exactly when they could leave. Artillery had to continue firing long enough to conceal the intention. Rear guards had to remain in their trenches while the main body had already begun moving. The soldiers at the front had to create the impression that Germany was still preparing for a long defense. If they withdrew too early, the Red Army might discover the opening and attack before the plan was complete. If they waited too long, the rear guards could be cut off. And if one road became blocked, entire formations might be trapped inside the very salient they were trying to escape. This was the final paradox of Rzhev. The Germans had used the routes inside the salient to defend it. Now they had to use those same routes to dismantle it piece by piece. For weeks, preparations unfolded behind the front. Ammunition, fuel, supplies, and valuable equipment were moved westward. New positions were prepared along a shorter defensive line. Roads were repaired so they could carry the withdrawal columns. Formations received movement schedules designed to prevent every unit from entering the same route at once. Meanwhile, the forward positions had to appear normal. Patrols continued going out. Artillery continued firing. Radio traffic helped create the impression that the German army intended to remain. A Red Army soldier looking across the snow-covered fields might see no obvious change. German machine guns still answered from the other side. Flares still rose into the night. Reconnaissance patrols still fought among the forests. But behind those trenches, sections of an entire army were quietly disappearing. When the main withdrawal began in March of 1943, German formations left their positions in stages. Units in the most visible sectors often remained longer. Rear area organizations moved first. They were followed by artillery, vehicles, and combat formations not required for the rear guard mission. Finally, the small groups left behind abandoned trenches that had been defended with so many lives. For a German soldier, that moment must have carried a difficult meaning. He was leaving a position where friends had died, a village that had changed hands more than once, a trench repaired after every bombardment, a forest where each path carried memories of patrols, ambushes, and men who had never returned. For months, leaving the position might have been treated as failure. Now leaving was the order required to preserve the army. It showed how strategy could change the meaning of the same action. Remaining had once represented determination. Now remaining might become recklessness. Withdrawal might once have appeared weak. Now withdrawal was the only way to prevent a defensive victory from ending in an encirclement disaster. But Operation Büffel was not a clean movement without consequences for the people living in the region. German forces destroyed roads, bridges, railways, stores, and facilities that might assist the advancing Red Army. Mines were laid along expected routes of pursuit. Homes and villages were destroyed as part of scorched earth measures. Civilians were forced from their homes or moved behind the German lines. Anti-partisan operations and repressive measures added another layer of suffering to communities that had already spent months between two armies. Calling Operation Büffel a military success therefore does not mean it should be described as a perfect escape without victims. It achieved the military objective of preserving much of the German force and shortening the front. But it left behind destroyed ground, hidden mines, and communities forced to pay for the strategic decisions of an occupying army. When the Red Army finally recognized the scale of the withdrawal and moved forward, it did not find the Ninth Army waiting for one final battle. Soviet troops advanced through abandoned positions. The trenches remained. The shelters remained. Villages once defended with extraordinary violence had been reduced to smoke, burned timber, and broken roads. After more than a year of attacks, Red Army soldiers finally entered Rzhev. That they did not enter after a decisive breakthrough. No enormous pocket had closed around the Germans. The Ninth Army had not been destroyed or forced to surrender. Most of the force the Soviet command had attempted to encircle had already escaped. That made the question of victory at Rzhev far more complicated than an arrow on a map. The Red Army recovered the city and removed the threat to Moscow. The salient ceased to exist. The German front moved farther west. After months of fighting and loss, an important Soviet political and strategic objective had finally been achieved. But it had not been achieved in the way Soviet planners intended. The Ninth Army had not been destroyed. The earlier offensives had failed to complete their encirclements, and when Soviet troops entered Rzhev, the enemy had selected the time and method of departure. From the German perspective, Operation Büffel was a tactical success. Model removed most of his army from a dangerous position. The front was shortened. Formations became available to rest, rebuild, or serve in other sectors. The Germans avoided the danger of another Stalingrad in the central part of the front. Yet the success was also an admission. Rzhev no longer served its old purpose. The threat directed toward Moscow had been abandoned. Ground defended through repeated battles was surrendered without a final stand, and Germany had begun moving from an attempt to hold every defensible position toward an effort to preserve armies it could no longer easily replace. That is why Rzhev cannot be reduced to the statement that one side won and the other lost. The Red Army failed in several operational objectives. The Germans successfully defended the salient and then successfully withdrew from it. But across the full sequence of battles, Germany's strategic position still became weaker. It held the battlefield. Until holding it no longer served the war Germany was now fighting. The Soviet offensives did not produce a decisive victory at Rzhev, but they helped transform the salient into an increasingly expensive commitment. Stalingrad did not directly drive the Germans out of Rzhev, but it changed the value of the forces tied down there. Operation Büffel was not a panic flight, but the need for the withdrawal revealed that Germany could no longer pursue the ambitions that had oscillated Rzhev value. The answer to the central paradox therefore lies in the difference between tactics and strategy. The Red Army could not capture Rzhev by direct force because German defensive depth, strength, logistics, and Soviet limitations in coordination prevented breakthroughs from becoming encirclements, but the Germans still abandoned it because after Stalingrad, the value of the salient no longer justified its extended front of the forces required to protect it, and the day that the Ninth Army might eventually become trapped into it. The Germans did not leave because they had lost one final battle. They left because they no longer had a reason to keep winning the same battle again, and that may be the most enduring lesson of an army can hold every trench in front of it while gradually losing the power to choose its future. A position can be defended successfully after it has lost its strategic value. A withdrawal can be a military success while also proving that a greater ambition has failed. Where did not end with the image of a defensive line being crushed. It ended with empty carriages, with vehicle tracks leading west, with Red Army soldiers entering a city they had not captured in a final battle, and with a question that reaches far beyond this battlefield. Should a commander continue holding a position because so many men have already died to defend it, or withdraw before the price of the past demands all lives for a purpose that no longer exists? Hear your answer in the comment.